Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and good afternoon to my esteemed colleagues and dear friends at the Korea Wind Energy Industry Association. It's a great privilege to be joining you from Berlin. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there in person, but very grateful for the invitation to be joining you virtually nonetheless. As mentioned, my name is Joyce Lee. I work as the Head of Policy and Projects at the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC. And GWEC is a good friend of the Korean Wind Energy Industry Association, and very glad to be with you today on the Global Wind Day Celebration Seminar for Korea. So what I will be going through today is a global wind market update and an outlook for the next 5 to 10 years, covering both onshore and offshore wind. And I will also be touching on the prospects and opportunities and the policy growth drivers for onshore and offshore wind across Asia-Pacific economies. Just a few notes on who we are as the Global Wind Energy Council. We're a nonprofit industry association which promotes wind power across the world. We represent the full value chain of wind power, including developers, IPPs, OEMs, manufacturers, suppliers, and more. We also represent the industry associations around the world. So those include the Korean Wind Energy Industry Association, the American Clean Power Association, Wind Europe, Renewable UK, the South African Association, the Brazilian Association, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Australians, really a global association of associations. And this means that GWEC has a representative role for the entire global wind power industry, particularly within international institutions like the IEA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and the UNFCCC. As a trade body and as an advocacy body, we work with governments across the world, but especially in new and emerging markets for wind power, to help them understand the benefits and opportunities and create a positive, enabling policy and regulatory environment for wind power to take off. We also do a lot of work with capacity building with wind associations around the world, especially in those newer markets for wind where there might not be an industry association on the ground already. With that, I'm going to turn to the presentation part and begin with a look back at 2021. So the next few slides take a look at our market status. Where is the wind market today? Well, it's a very positive market update. We, as you can see from the graph here, in the last 2 decades, we're starting at 2001 all the way to 2021. We've seen new wind power installations, a very healthy measure of market growth, exponentially rise over the last 2 decades. We had our second best year in history in 2021 with 93.6 gigawatts of new installations. Those are new wind projects connected to the grid, onshore and offshore wind around the world. And that's the second best year because it trails just behind 2020, which was a record year for wind power with 95.3 gigawatts of wind installed. So it's just around 1.8% below where we were with new installations in 2020, but still a very good sign for wind power growth. If you break that down into new onshore installations, it's 72.5 gigawatts installed last year around the world, and then 21.1 gigawatts of offshore wind installations. I think this is exceptional in particular because we were in many areas of the world still facing severe impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in many large wind markets like China, India, and the US, including as well as in Europe, where there were second and third waves of the pandemic. There were travel restrictions which prevented workers from traveling to site for construction and surveying needs. There were lockdown issues which also impacted manufacturing. And nevertheless, despite these challenges, we were able to deliver nearly 94 gigawatts around the world. Altogether, when we sum up the new wind power installations from the beginning of the industry to the end of 2021, that puts the market at 837 gigawatts of cumulative wind installations. which is a growth year on year of 12.4% compared to 2020. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on onshore wind and then offshore wind. So I mentioned it was the second best year for wind total last year, and that's the same status for onshore wind in particular. We had 72.5 gigawatts of onshore wind installed across many of the markets that you see listed here in the graph on the right. And then the yellow segment of this donut graph is representing the rest of the world. So you have the top markets summed up in each of these labels. And just to name the top 5 markets, which were representative of 3/4 of total global onshore wind installations last year, those came from China, the US, Brazil, Vietnam, and Sweden. And this is quite an exciting story. I think it tells a few narratives. It tells the increasing dominance of China in terms of new wind power installations. We'll see the same story told when we look at offshore wind. There are legacy markets for onshore wind growth in the US and Europe. This is quite familiar, but we're also seeing increasing activity now in the top 5 markets in developing economies like Brazil and even Vietnam. What drove the onshore wind growth last year is largely market mechanisms and procurement frameworks for wind, including the expiration of feed-in tariffs and the production tax credit in the US. So these were extended in light of COVID-related difficulties for the industry, for not just wind, but also other renewables industries. And that allowed a rush to market to happen, which really helped to drive growth to the levels that we saw in China and the US. While in legacy areas like Europe, Asia, China especially, as well as North America, there was not record high growth. In other areas, we did see record high growth for onshore wind. So Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East did reach new levels of onshore wind installations last year, which also goes to this narrative of the market diversification that's happening in the global wind market. And now we look at offshore wind. I know there's a lot of excitement about offshore wind in Korea in particular. So we're looking now at the 21.1 gigawatts of new offshore wind installations around the world last year, and which markets those offshore wind installations were delivered in. As you can see, we have a similar picture of China dominating the new installations for last year, taking more than 80% of the new installations for offshore wind. So an incredible achievement. I think when you take a step back and look at just that summary figure, the absolute figure of 21.1 gigawatts, that's 3 times more than the world installed in 2020. So we're really seeing a huge momentum and step change for the pace of build of offshore wind and the delivery. And largely in China, this was driven by the pressures for offshore wind to reach grid parity and the expiration of the offshore wind feed-in tariff by the end of 2021. So that's for projects reaching grid connection by the end of 2021. China alone has now 27.7 gigawatts of cumulative installed offshore wind capacity, which is also incredible because this is a level which took Europe 3 decades to achieve. And China has reached this in the span of about 10 years or so. 2021 is also exceptional because China has now replaced the UK as the top offshore wind market globally in terms of cumulative installations. And that's not to say that there's lesser activity in the UK and Europe. As you can see here, among our top markets for offshore wind build, UK, Vietnam, Denmark, Netherlands, Taiwan, and Norway were among the top countries that built offshore winds last year. And I will pull out a special mention for Vietnam because this is a new market. We're seeing it as the top 3 market for new offshore wind installations already. And this is with a special nuance that this offshore wind is nearshore or intertidal wind. So it's not what we might deem a true offshore wind, but in the Vietnamese policy context, this is seen as a form of offshore wind. I think in total, if you're looking for the cumulative offshore wind installations now in the world, it's about 56 gigawatts. So we've looked at the market data, and now I'll talk a little bit about the broader market trends and policy trends which are impacting the wind market and getting it to the place that we saw at the end of 2021. And I'll do this in a very simplified way, which is to look at both the barriers to growth and the enablers to growth that we saw for the global wind market. So starting from the top at the barriers, I mentioned already the COVID-19 related disruptions, which did have an impact on commissioning deadlines and the ability to reach COD and then reach grid connection in some of the major wind markets like the US, India, and for offshore wind in Taiwan, where we expected actually a few hundred more megawatts of offshore wind to be installed in Taiwan, but this was delayed due to COVID. We've also seen, and I'm sure this has been a familiar story in Korea, but supply chain challenges and supply chain pressures begin to push back on the ability to deliver on time in terms of the procurement segment of the value chain, and also in terms of the bidding and pre-development studies part of the value chain. So in terms of supply chain challenges, we can break this down into different factors. We're seeing rising inflation, we're seeing rising interest rates, financing costs are not as cheap as they were a few years ago. Freight costs in 2021 were raised by order of magnitude, and this happened especially after the Suez Canal crisis, which created a deep bottleneck that affected global freight and shipping. And then increasing commodity prices, especially in the kind of post-COVID industrial recovery curve, where we saw price increases very sharply for materials like steel, copper, and nickel, which are key inputs to the onshore and offshore wind supply chain. That said, the supply chain pressures are in confluence with other types of pressures, including cost pressures on developers and the supply chain at procurement stage. So we're seeing this, what we call a race to the bottom mentality on cost and procurement for renewable energy generation. This race to the bottom comes from a thinking that wind and even grid-scale solar have delivered incredible cost competitiveness in markets around the world, beating out new fossil fuel plants in terms of LCOE. And the thinking is that renewables will continue to get cheaper and cheaper, but in this difficult environment of inflation and interest rates, this is not quite the case. So although we're seeing a lot more pressure around the auction environment, we did see increased activity for auctions last year. So auction capacity for wind was still up by 153%. From 2021 to 2020, and we saw 88 gigawatts of onshore and offshore wind awarded globally through auctions. In Europe, we also saw some barriers to growth around regulation and around permitting. I wasn't able to understand fully the last speaker, but I did hear one-stop shop mentioned as a concept. So this is certainly within the realm of permitting and is one of the resolutions which are being looked at to fix some of the legacy market challenges which are centered around permitting and regulation. The slowness, the delays, the complex bureaucracy around permitting, legal opposition, legal challenges, which are being raised by minority interest groups and can delay projects for months, if not years. This is really starting to show in the tendering for projects in Europe. So last year we saw undersubscribed tenders in fairly hefty onshore wind markets in Europe, like Germany, Italy, and Poland. But looking on the positive side, we had some major enablers for wind market growth last year. Right from the top, oil and gas majors, the sort of oil and gas super major companies in the world are really doubling down on offshore wind. So we're seeing major breakthroughs into investment in R&D and technology and pre-development work for floating offshore wind around the world. And we're also seeing the oil and gas majors make major inroads into the seabed leasing rounds in Europe and North America. Last year, for instance, UK round 4 auction, as well as ScotWind, and then most recently the New York Bight auction in February earlier this year. We also saw wind cost competitiveness continue to take off. And where this is particularly exciting is in enabling bilateral transactions in the so-called bilateral market, or you might call it the corporate market, for corporate PPAs outside a regulated market or regulated procurement. And this has really gained popularity in some markets like Brazil, where the volume of offtake in the corporate market is actually larger than the volume of offtake in the regulated market, because wind is seen as so cost competitiveness. So in Brazil, this helped wind to achieve nearly 4 gigawatts of installations last year. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but carbon neutrality has been a major enabler of growth, because we're seeing this concept, we're seeing this target go mainstream with nations all around the world. So by November 2021, by COP26 last year, we had coverage of national net zero targets for countries that represented more than 80% of global GDP and around 77% of global greenhouse gas emissions. However, when we look at the details, as we know, the devil is in the details, and IRENA has found that for those countries which have strong and robust targets and very clear and concrete plans to reach net zero, could be net zero by 2050, it could be as late as 2070, those countries only cover 10% of global GDP and about 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So I think between the ambition and then getting to the market realities in terms of implementing a net zero target with policy and regulation, there's still quite a gap there, but a positive trend nonetheless. So that is the section on our market status up to the end of 2021, and we'll now be moving into more of a forward-looking section of market outlook. For GWEC, our market outlook for onshore wind extends out 5 years, so we're looking out to 2026. And then for offshore wind, it extends out 10 years, so we're looking to 2031, just because offshore wind has longer development timelines, longer procurement timelines as well. And that helps us to ensure that our data is accurate and has integrity with our time horizons. So starting from the global outlook for both onshore and offshore wind, it's a very positive outlook when we look out to 2026 with compound annual growth of nearly 7% over the next 5 years. And this is due to a few major, let's say, kind of super trends. So one is what I mentioned around net zero commitments. This kind of high-level policy environment is increasingly in favor of more ambition for renewable energy and wind energy, especially, I would say, offshore wind energy as a major displacement technology to conventional fossil fuels. And this is really positioning wind as a predominant player for the global energy transition. Another emerging trend, which is actually not from 2021, but it influences our outlook for the next 5 years, is the energy security conversation and energy affordability conversation, which has taken a forefront in the light of the invasion of Ukraine. And this means that there's an increasing urgency for policymakers to reduce a dependency, reduce their reliance on fossil fuels, which have been roiled over the last year in terms of market and price volatility in coal, oil, and gas. And so this means that transition to an indigenous, sustainable, and more energy independent form of an energy system based on, let's say, grid scale renewable energy like wind and solar energy, that has made our midterm outlook stronger than ever. When we break this growth down into onshore and offshore wind, so compound annual growth looks like 6.1% for onshore wind, with average installations of 93.3 gigawatts over the next 5 years. And then for offshore wind, we have around 8.3% compound annual growth rate. It's a faster growth pace than onshore wind. And then the average annual installations are around 18.1 gigawatts year on year. I would say for offshore wind, this is still quite exciting. Last year, we were looking at, by the end of 2020, we had around 35 gigawatts of total installed offshore wind capacity around the world. And now we're looking at installing an average of 18 gigawatts per year. So this is, again, a real symptom that offshore wind is becoming a true kind of powerhouse of a market. And to that end, I thought it would be helpful to especially focus on offshore wind, given the interest in Korea on offshore wind. And as I mentioned, our outlook goes out to 2031. There's a few kind of major headlines here. So one is that by the end of this decade, cumulative offshore wind is set to exceed 365 gigawatts worldwide. I mentioned by 2020, we had 35 gigawatts. So we're growing by more than 10 times over this decade in terms of cumulative capacity, which is quite incredible. If we look at the total new installations that we're adding, that's about 315 gigawatts, which will be added through 2031. Another headline here is by the end of 2031, we'll be around 370 gigawatts. And this gets us really close to the net zero milestones that have been put in place by IRENA and the IEA, and for IRENA in particular, in their 1.5 degree and net zero roadmap. Offshore wind reaches 380 gigawatts by 2030. And by reaching 370 gigawatts by 2031, this gets us incredibly close for this market to be on track to deliver its role in the energy transition. And I think many of you will be familiar with this kind of gap in net zero ambition versus net zero market reality. But for offshore wind, the outlook really does get us near to fulfillment of offshore wind's potential and offshore wind's necessary mitigation in these net zero roadmaps. So this is a very exciting point. And another headline is that wind is going to be rising as a share of total wind installations. So by the middle of this decade already, by 2025, 1/4 of total new wind installations are going to comprise of offshore wind. Another headline here is you can see the growth trajectory really ticks up by the second end of the decade. So in the latter part of the decade, we're really starting to see offshore wind market diversification come through. Europe, represented here in the teal, continues to be a huge legacy and driving market for offshore wind. China, as a single market, represented here in the green, continues to have a large share of the global market. But we're starting to see more and more color come through, and those represent Asia ex-China, so markets like Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Vietnam. By the end of the decade, markets like India as well. And then in North America, so more and more activity coming from the US through the latter end of the decade. I went through the market outlook in terms of our market intelligence. So this is under our, let's say, BAU or business as usual trajectory. And now I wanted to turn to compare this to our net zero trajectory, because as a Global Wind Day celebration, we're always looking to the future, and this is really our North Star of what is wind's role in delivering climate action globally. So this chart is from the IRENA 1.5 degree scenario and net zero by 2050 roadmap. And it really shows us a picture of the electricity generation transforming from 2018 on the left to 2050 on the right. You can see that gray shaded area represents the reduction of so-called fossil fuels. So coal, oil, natural gas. They also include reduction of nuclear energy within this. And then you can see on the right-hand column that renewable energy is really increasing by order of magnitude in the share of the global power mix by 2050. We have onshore wind represented in this kind of turquoise color, and then offshore wind represented in the blue color. In terms of a breakdown of capacity, by 2050, a net zero power mix would have 6.1 terawatts of onshore wind capacity and about 2 terawatts of offshore wind capacity. And that means that IRENA is targeting wind to provide more than 1/3 of global electricity by 2050. We're in a moment of historic consensus. I want to make this very clear, and this is really one of the key takeaways of the presentation. Last year saw the agreement and alignment of the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and IRENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, in what a 2050 net zero power mix should look like. So these are the two major international energy authority bodies, both intergovernmental in the world, and they agree on what a global power mix should look like. And it's roughly a 63 to 70% power mix made up of grid scale wind and solar energy. And for us celebrating Global Wind Day, it's very positive news because they both agree that wind power becomes the dominant source of electricity generation by 2050. So IRENA sees it generating around 34% of electricity globally. That's more than solar power. And the IEA sees it as dominant share with 35% of electricity generation. Again, that's more than solar power. So a very exciting picture for us and one of the major takeaways for 2021. And what does that mean for our growth trajectory? Because I mentioned I would compare how we're doing with a business as usual path against where we need to be with a net zero path. When we look at the milestones we need to reach by 2030 to get on track for that picture of net zero by 2050, we need to scale up annual wind installations by around 4 times over the course of this decade. And that means we're at this roughly 95 gigawatts of installations per year. We need to scale that up to 390 gigawatts by the end of 2030. So it's a positive outlook for wind. There's a lot to draw on market diversification, et cetera. But when we compare this to the necessity for wind power's role in fighting climate change, there's still a large gap to close. And just a few words on how we can message, how we can communicate about wind power so we can start to close this gap. So one of the major factors that's really being recognized now is the large-scale fossil fuel displacement potential for wind. I'll get to the energy security factor in a second, but this is really about mitigation and displacement per gigawatt of installed capacity. So on the left here is a focus on offshore wind. This graph is from the UN Ocean Panel report in 2020, and it looked at 5 different areas for ocean-based climate action. This included ocean-based renewable energy, ocean-based transport, like getting to net zero shipping, coastal and marine ecosystems. So you're starting to look at potential carbon sink beds like mangroves, fisheries, aquaculture, and dietary shifts. So increasing behavioral change in humans to lessen the amount of meat in diets, increase the amount of fish, and then carbon storage in seabed. And it mapped out the mitigation that could be delivered by each of these solutions. And by far, the most prominent ocean-based solution is in renewable energy, and is it primarily in offshore wind, of course. That, according to the Ocean Panel, can deliver about half of the necessary ocean-based mitigation solutions needed for a net zero by 2050 scenario. So I think in the offshore wind context, it gives a really strong argument for offshore wind as one of the key ocean-based solutions to climate change. And then we start to look at displacement potential for onshore and offshore wind on the right. This comes from the IEA, and it looks at per gigawatt of installed capacity, what can different energy technologies deliver in terms of displacement potential. So we look at unabated coal to begin with, and you can see that per gigawatt, offshore wind delivers by far the most bang for your buck in terms of displacement potential. Onshore wind is pretty high up there in the second column in the purple, and then hydropower is kind of second in the running there. Compared to solar, compared to what the IEA terms efficient gas, you can see offshore and onshore wind deliver a huge degree of value when it comes to displacement. And then on the right side, there's a natural gas comparison. So to displace natural gas, 1 gigawatt of offshore wind and onshore wind deliver by far the most value in addition to hydro. And then finally, I've mentioned the invasion of Ukraine and what this has meant for the urgency that being felt by policymakers around the world to replace fossil fuels with renewables. On the left here, you can see from mid-2021 to early 2022, this is what oil and gas markets have looked like in wholesale spot prices. So they've spiked, by 3 to 4 times over the course of 6 months. It's been extremely volatile, and it hasn't been a steady spike as well. You can see that there's quite a lot of up and downs around the winter periods. We're seeing extreme spikes in the price for natural gas in particular. That's the orange line. And going into this winter 2022, there is shared expectation from industry observers and from energy analysts that this volatility is set to continue. And what this means is the policy environment is changing for renewables. So this is a quote from the IRENA Director General, Francesco La Camera, from March of this year, and he says, "It's high time to act. Recent developments have clearly demonstrated that high fossil fuel prices can result in energy poverty and loss of industrial competitiveness. 80% of the global population live in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels. By contrast, renewables are available in all countries, offering a way out of import dependency and allowing countries to decouple economies from the cost of fossil fuels while driving economic growth and new jobs." So I think we're starting to see a shift in the discourse about wind energy now, where before we may have focused on carbon emissions mitigation, we may have focused on job creation, inward capital investment, but you can see now that the balance of trade in import-export for energy, energy security and independency, and energy affordability, now that the fossil fuel volatility is forcing many households into what's called fuel poverty or energy poverty, are really becoming realities, that there's a new set of arguments emerging for wind energy. And those are the drivers of the global picture, but I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the challenges. So what could be holding back wind growth when we look out into the horizon, out to 2030 and then out to 2050? This is a radar graph, which is the results of a perception survey that GWEC conducted earlier this year among our associations and among our members. And what it represents is the perception of challenges to wind energy growth. So the short-term challenges next 5 years are in the teal shaded area or the blue shaded area. And then the long-term challenges, let's say we look at to 2030, 2050, are in the green shaded area. And the challenges which are more severe have nodes which are closer to the outer circle. So where you see more extreme spikes, that means the challenges are more severe. There's no time to go into each of these factors, but I think the headline here is that the challenges are really perceived to be concentrated in two domains, which are system design and society. So system design, we can break this into the value proposition for wind energy versus coal and gas, the cost pressure for procurement. So again, looking at the pressure to deliver lowest cost of electricity rather than the highest value for money for electricity. Permitting timelines as well. This is affected in terms of social acceptance, social consensus for the transition. So the degree to which political administration change, the degree to which legal challenges could potentially slow down the transition, and then land allocation and land use being a factor of society acceptance of wind energy. These are all perceived by the industry to be the greatest challenges to wind's growth. And I think many of these will be familiar to the Korean audience here today. And as a takeaway, that means to really accelerate wind energy, to overcome these challenges, we need the right market signals, we need the right incentives to be in place. That means more efficient and streamlined permitting. Again, mentioning that one-stop shop concept is a great start. Land and seabed availability for wind projects needs to increase so we can really get more efficiencies, economies of scale, and a consistent pipeline to deliver investment in the industry, investment in the supply chain. And on the social consensus issue, we need to be more collaborative as an industry. We need all stakeholders to be working together to build acceptance about the pace and the scale. So really the speed by which we need wind energy growth to happen. So that includes collaboration, not just between government and industry, but also civil society, non-governmental organizations, creating more participation for local stakeholders, which host renewable energy projects. And just a special note on permitting. I'm afraid looking at the size of the room, this text is probably illegible for most of you. Maybe those in the front will be able to read, but this this extract comes from our Global Wind Report 2022, and it's really a heat map of where permitting is particularly challenging. The takeaway is that permitting is a global issue. We hear a lot about permitting challenges in Europe, for instance, for good reason, but permitting holds back wind projects around the world. So just to give you a few examples and data points, offshore wind permitting in the US can generally take around 6 years. I think we'll start to see this shorten as the market matures, but this is what the earliest projects are facing. In Mexico, renewable energy projects can take around 3 years to permit, largely due to land disputes and local opposition. In many European markets, it can take more than 8 years to permit onshore wind, including Spain, Italy, Greece, Sweden, Belgium, and Croatia. So more than 8 years for onshore wind, just the permitting stage. In the UK, between 2016 and 2020, only 16 onshore wind turbines in 7 locations received planning permission. That's 1/6, it's not 60. So in 4 years, there were only 16 turbines for onshore wind that received planning permission. In Kenya, it can be very difficult with local land opposition. In Japan, up to 8 years to complete the environmental impact assessment for onshore and offshore wind. In Vietnam, it requires nearly 20 approvals from different authorities to gain wind permitting. In India, land acquisition alone can take up to 2 years. So we're just looking at one part of the permitting process. Overall, this means this is a problem for the wind industry as a whole. So we really need to work together to share the best practices and improve permitting around the world. All right, I'm entering the last part of my presentation. I know I'm probably nearing the time limit for my session as well. And this one really focuses on what's happening with the wind outlook in the Asia Pacific. So looking at Asia in particular. This is a picture of a regional breakdown of the global outlook for onshore and offshore wind out to 2026. So you can see a few things here in terms of percentage share for each region. China dominates the global wind outlook from 33% to up to 49% of the global market for the next 5 years. We see Europe continuing to play its driving role in the global market from around 14% to 18% of the market. And then we're starting to see other markets come through. So North America, the US continues to drive with onshore wind, but Asia ex-China is delivering steady growth. So 5% to 7%, that's in the yellow segments there, over the next 5 years. And then the offshore wind market, as mentioned, grows to about a quarter of new wind installations by 2026. In 2021, just a few top notes for Asia ex-China. So Vietnam, as mentioned, had a great year for offshore wind, top 3 market. And then in onshore wind, it made up 57% of the new onshore wind installations in Asia outside China. India had a tough year as a top 5 wind market globally because of the second wave of COVID, but it still awarded more than 20 gigawatts of new wind capacity across wind tenders and increasingly across hybrid tenders, or what they call round-the-clock tenders, to deliver 24-hour generation. And that was awarded by the end of 2021. We are going to see further growth in Asia ex-China from a whole host of markets. So just to name a few: Vietnam, India, Japan, Korea, of course, Pakistan, and then the emerging markets in Southeast Asia are going to start playing a bigger role in onshore and offshore wind: Philippines, Laos, Thailand, and Indonesia. And then a huge amount of interest in onshore and offshore wind in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and then in offshore wind, Azerbaijan is now looking at its offshore wind strategy. So an Asia-focused breakdown of offshore wind out to 2031. Familiar story again, the blue bars are made up by mainland China. You can see we've summed up the share of the Chinese market within the Asia region on the bottom here. So it made up 95% of the Asian market for offshore wind last year. And this starts to come down as, again, I said, towards the latter end of the decade. Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and then Vietnam and India start to play bigger roles. So by 2031, China is only 63% of the Asia market for offshore wind. You can see from about 2026 onwards, there's a sort of step change, and we're starting to see more markets deliver in gigawatt scale to total installations. So this is looking at kind of 1 to 1.5, 1.2 gigawatts delivered by South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and then India, which I'll talk about India in a second, but has a very ambitious procurement plan in place for offshore wind. So I'm going to start to look at some of the policy drivers around Asian markets. When we look at the total allocation of Asian offshore wind out to 2031, it's about 136 gigawatts of new installations that we're forecasting over the next 10 years. Top lines are that Taiwan is set to become the second largest offshore wind market in Asia. It already is after mainland China. And then major offshore wind volume is going to start coming online from 2027 in South Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Some of the points around these markets is that in Taiwan, recovering from some of the COVID-related difficulties of last year, we are likely to see up to 2 gigawatts of new capacity added by the end of this year. And that puts them more on track to achieve their national target of 5.6 gigawatts by 2025. In South Korea, as you know, there's a target of 12 gigawatts by 2030, although there's some key permitting and grid and transmission infrastructure barriers which must be resolved. Japan has one of the largest offshore wind targets in the world, up to 45 gigawatts by 2040, under the December 2020 offshore wind industry vision released by METI. They have already launched their first auctions for fixed and floating offshore wind in their designated promotion zones. However, their third auction is delayed due to some transparency and competitiveness concerns with the first fixed bottom auction in December of last year. In Vietnam, I already mentioned there was a record year for intertidal or nearshore projects, but we've seen a huge amount of ambition expressed in the new PDP-8 Master Energy Plan, which is set to be finalized this month, I hope. Last year, early versions of that plan had as little as 0 gigawatts for offshore wind targeted by 2030. And over 1 year, the thinking has changed so much that they're now targeting more than 7 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So their ambition is definitely growing. And the industry is just waiting for clarification on procurement framework, if there will be a feed-in tariff or bilateral negotiations with EVN and MOIT for PPAs. And finally, I mentioned the first batches of offshore wind are going to take place in India by the end of the decade, as well as by the Philippines, if things go well. I'll make a special note of India because India has just released its offshore wind bid allocation timeline through the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. They would like to put up to 37 gigawatts of offshore wind up for bidding by 2030. So 37 gigawatts. That means they're starting very early in terms of their timeline. They would like to bid out 4 gigawatts this year, 4 gigawatts next year, and then 4 gigawatts in 2024. And then from 2025 to 2029, it goes up to 5+ gigawatts in terms of annual selection rounds and auction rounds for offshore wind. So India has put forward one of the most aggressive timelines that I've seen in terms of offshore wind capacity allocation. And I think we're excited to see that and working together with the government there to try to really implement this. It's a very ambitious plan. A final note on the market drivers. So I think leaving the audience here today with some of the kind of lessons learned for some of these key offshore wind markets in Asia. In Taiwan, what we had to really make this the second biggest market in Asia is ambitious targets and a holistic green economy vision for offshore wind's role in creating an industrially competitive Taiwan. So there was a very transparent and long horizon given to the pipeline of procurement out to 2035, where we've already seen, more than 10 years ahead of time, the round 3 targets are in place, targeting 15 gigawatts procured from 2026 to 2035. So this is significant volume, and this is significant time given to the industry to prepare for this level of investment and supply chain requirements. The first auctions to procure this capacity are already going to take place in the next 3 years. So I think some of the lessons here is really the time horizon, the preparation periods necessary for the industry to understand, create the feasibility studies, create the necessary supply chain research, analysis, and partnerships to make such a large-scale volume materialize. And you can see that this is happening successfully in Taiwan because there's been significant supply chain investments in blade manufacturing, nacelle manufacturing, and the first heavy lifting vessel for offshore wind being built in Taiwan. That's already underway due to this policy coherence, as well as that long time horizon. In India, it's really about ambition. So they're targeting 140 gigawatts of wind by 2030, of which 30 gigawatts is offshore wind. So I said they're trying to allocate 37 gigawatts of capacity by 2030. Of this, I think it remains to be seen how close they will get to the installation target of 30 gigawatts, but they've certainly put forward a very aggressive target. And this does give some degree of confidence to the industry. India also benefits from being a major supply chain hub for the wind power sector already in onshore wind, supplying not just the domestic market, but also Asian markets. For instance, as the West Coast China and during COVID in 2020, as there were Chinese lockdowns, India's supply chain heated up to pick up some of the exporting activity to supply for the sector in the region. We're also seeing some good opportunities from India coming from hybrid tenders. So they're starting to look more at the confluence of wind, solar storage working together and bidding together for generation. And then other opportunities are repowering. There's quite a few onshore wind projects up for repowering, offshore wind, a national green hydrogen strategy, and then increasing demand from the commercial and industrial sector, or what in India they call the big public sector the entities like Indian oil and gas, for instance. In South Korea, I've mentioned the big kind of ambitions around 12 gigawatts by 2030 and then a net zero by 2050 target, which really does give that the foundational policy, puts the foundational policy in place for renewable energy generation. We also see a strong factor in the manufacturing incumbents in South Korea. So strong public-private partnerships are increasingly in place. And there's a lot of existing expertise to leverage around steel and shipbuilding, logistics, and very advanced ports and port technology. In Japan, a very ambitious vision in the offshore wind industry vision, targeting up to 45 gigawatts by 2040. We are now seeking more clarity, what we are calling a grand strategy, or what others might call a route to market, for reaching 45 gigawatts by 2040. I think the key here is going to be collaboration, cooperation to learn from the initial auction rounds that have already taken place. So this is the takeaway here is keeping a dialogue between government and industry is going to be really important for continuous learning and continuous improvement of regulatory frameworks. And then finally, in Southeast Asia, Vietnam is emerging very strongly as the wind leader of Southeast Asia, kickstarted by the feed-in tariff, but now with ever higher targets for onshore and offshore wind in the PDP8 draft. But there's a lot of activity happening in the Philippines and Thailand as well. The Philippines is unveiling has already unveiled its one-stop shop concept for renewables and its green energy auction program, which is very exciting. And Thailand is doing a lot of great work on smart grids and has its own significant interest from the corporate sector as well for renewable energy procurement. So I think that brings me to the end of the presentation and I think the end of my time with you, but I really appreciate your attention and your patience. I hope this has been informative and really welcome any any contact or communication, please send me an email at GWEC. We're really looking forward to working more closely with our partners, Korea, as well as other partners in Korea, and seeing great things for offshore wind in Korea and onshore wind in Korea in the next decade. So thank you very much.